Eventually, we'll wake up one day and they'll have us surrounded, and then our options will be limited.
We believe that they are developing other facilities like that, and it's a concern to the Biden administration, who's now working to try to counter it.
We are clear-eyed about the challenges posed by the PRC.
New revelations expose that China is closer to US shores than ever before. A growing presence in Cuba now a major concern for the Biden administration. Is this another Cuban Missile Crisis waiting to happen? Sky News Digital Originals presents China Tensions, the Cuba Plan. Terrifying revelations from the Wall Street Journal that the Chinese are looking to build a military training facility on the island of Cuba, less than 100 miles off the US coast.
We first reported that there was an agreement in principle for an electronic eavesdropping facility that was essentially all but done. We're reporting that now, as you say, that there's plans for a military training, a joint military training facility of some kind on Cuba, and so these are likely two different conversations or one and the same. It's very hard. The intelligence that's come in on any of this, I think there's kind of essentially a paucity of intelligence. So that leaves room for a lot of interpretation by different U.S. agencies about what it means and how far it could go. But what we're reporting is, the possibility of a deal that could put Chinese members of the PLA 100 miles away from the Florida coast.
The Chinese are playing a game of Go, which is a 2,500-year-old board game where the objective is to surround more territory than your opponent. And so what you see playing out now is the Chinese doing that. They've been in the Middle East, right, with Iran and Saudi Arabia trying to broker a deal. They're with Russia trying to influence the Ukraine fight. They're now in the Caribbean in a overt way. They've been in Central America trying to do bases. And so what you see is them just trying to surround us all the way around. And similar to the balloons, it's just another way of exercising their power.
This is another indication of how comprehensive and aggressive China's threat is to the security of the United States and our vital interests around the world. We haven't faced a threat like this, Neil, since the end of World War II. I mean, that's the reality of what we're dealing with. Back in 2019, they had one listening post there, and they expanded it to 4. I'm thinking, Neil, our government can't tell us too much, but we have a Navy base there, and I got to believe that we're putting some capability in there to mitigate those listening posts. We have eye-watering listening post capability ourselves, and I think we know how to mitigate what the Chinese believe they're going to get from that. Putting some troops into Cuba certainly is disturbing. I think it's more about poking us in the eye and intimidating us. It doesn't have any consequential military value that I could see.
The Chinese government has denied it has plans to place troops on America's doorstep.
I am not aware of the situation you have mentioned. We hope that the parties concerned will put more effort into enhancing mutual trust.
The US-Cuba relationship has a complicated history. After the failed US attempt to overthrow the Castro regime in Cuba with the Bay of Pigs invasion, tensions quickly escalated between the two neighbours. In 1962, the Soviet Union reached an agreement to place Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba. The now famous images of several missile sites began the onset of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
This urgent transformation of Cuba into an important strategic base by the presence of these large, long-range, and clearly offensive weapons of sudden mass destruction constitutes an explicit threat to the peace and security of all the Americas.
The Cuban Missile Crisis quickly became one of the tensest periods of the Cold War.
But the greatest danger of all would be to do nothing. The path we have chosen for the present is full of hazards, as all paths are. But it is the one most consistent with our character and courage as a nation and our commitments around the world. The cost of freedom is always high, but Americans have always paid it. and one path we shall never choose, and that is the path of surrender or submission. Our goal is not the victory of might, but the vindication of right. Not peace at the expense of freedom, but both peace and freedom here in this hemisphere, and we hope around the world. God willing, that goal will be achieved.
Reports of an increased presence from China and Cuba are a stark reminder of the tense relationship the two countries have.
In many respects, it's less the intelligence than the symbology. If we remember back to the 1960s, the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? The Russians came into Cuba and they gradually built up to the point where they put missiles that could hit the United States there. And so what the Chinese are doing is taking steps in to see whether they can be tolerated there. In many ways, right, trying to get a foothold in the door, and then, right, it's the training bases next. And once you have a training base, right, well, are they bringing weapons? What are they bringing in? And now all of a sudden, it's not that you have intelligence, 90 miles from Florida. It's that you have Chinese weapons and systems, Chinese aircraft, perhaps Chinese aircraft carriers now transiting between the United States and Cuba. So that's what they're trying to do. But it's a very dangerous game for both the Cubans and the Chinese, right? The United States, right, the Kennedy administration did not, take warmly to when the Russians did that, and they responded, fairly aggressively once it became public. So now that this is public and we know that there's going to be training there, what happens when missiles and aircraft and ships start showing up? The Chinese have started doing that in Djibouti, right, in Africa, and they're putting ships, and so they're slowly testing the water to see what they can get away with without ratcheting things up. And we're allowing them to, in many ways, we're like the frog in the proverbial, boiling pot of water where the heat's being turned up slowly. We don't notice it.
The U.S. starting, or at least within recent years, starting under the Trump administration and continued partly under the Biden administration, has, that relationship's been rockier than, say, it was under the Obama administration. And although the Biden people have attempted to kind of reach out in some ways on some issues to do with immigration, communications, travel, tourism, I think there's an opening for China with Cuba because of the state of play right now. Somebody else was positing that Cuba is also looking at the U.S. response to a lot of other things around the world and recognizing that maybe they have an opening. But I would say generally that Cuba has an opening to work closer with China. But I think overall, Havana is very interested in an American response to whatever it is they do. So they're treading pretty carefully, and no one expects this relationship to develop or continue developing very quickly.
Well, it says that Cuba hasn't changed in the last, 70 years, right? They allowed the Russians to come in and put missiles there. They allowed anyone to come in. And right now, the Cubans need money. The Russians have cut them off. It was always about economic transactions because their economy is still stuck in many ways in the 1950s. So the Chinese are just putting money up and the Cubans are saying, sure. And it's also a way for the Cubans to poke at the United States for kind of, pulling back on, putting the embargo back on and cutting back on travel. So for the Cubans, it's a win-win. They get money and they get to annoy the United States out of it.
Let's let this sink in just for a moment, because you're right. This is a seminal, historic moment. We are on the verge of having Chinese Communist Party troops in the Caribbean, 100 miles from the southern coast of Florida. I mean, it's like taking me back to the 1980s, the movie Red Dawn, where you had Soviets and Cubans invading the United States. They're taking a play right out the Soviet playbook. But Laura, this is a world right now where our enemies, our adversaries, do not fear any consequences. They harass our planes, harass our ships, break into our bases, spy on our nuclear facilities with a sophisticated balloon, not a silly balloon, and now put troops in our back door, and they get rewarded with a meeting. It's truly astounding. It's dangerous, and this is how wars start.
Here in Beijing, I had an important conversation with President Xi Jinping, and I had candid, substantive, and constructive discussions with my counterparts, Director Wang Yi and State Councilor Qin Gong. I appreciate the hospitality extended by our hosts. In every meeting, I stress that direct engagement and sustained communication at senior levels is the best way to responsibly manage our differences and ensure that competition does not veer into conflict. And I heard the same from my Chinese counterparts. We both agree on the need to stabilize our relationship.
The timing of the dramatic escalation came as US Secretary of State Antony Blinken headed to China for talks.
It definitely was a topic of discussion. We got that from the public readout of Secretary Blinken's meeting with his counterpart with the Chinese government. It was Xi, and they discussed this among a lot of other different issues. As you know, there's reasonably high tensions between the two countries. President Biden seems to think that there's a thaw in relations. All that is debatable, but yes, this came up in the conversations, and I think the kind of extent of the idea of this training center, more listening posts, was definitely a topic of conversation, but we don't know exactly what the Chinese, how they responded.
What's happening now is, yes, we're trying to meet with them. They won't take our military phone calls. And the United States' policy of only doing one war at a time. We've said our defense strategy is to pull out of the Middle East. So they're filling all the vacuums around the world. And now we're going to them saying, hey, let's talk. And they're pretty much saying, we don't want to talk because we've now got you outflanked. We're starting to surround you. Yeah, and part of it is, again, with the United States strategy of being one war at a time, with the war going on in Europe, the Russian aggression, the United States is trying to dial that down. And the Chinese are more than happy to take advantage of all of that space and take advantage of the United States doing that. I think we've got to be much tougher and say, look, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can both cover down in the Middle East, we can cover down in Europe, and we can cover down in the Pacific, because it's not just the United States, it's us and all of our friends and allies that you're up against.
Yes, well, I applaud him for still being committed to diplomacy, but I think that this trip was a mistake. I was hoping it would at least just be neutral. I think it was negative, so probably, I don't know, D+, if I'm being generous. The reason that Blinken's trip was canceled last time was because in the wake of the Chinese spy balloon that traversed the United States. Back in February, Blinken said that we know with certainty that this was a surveillance balloon, that we know that it was actually surveilling sensitive military sites. Right. And China didn't apologize for that. And so and things have only deteriorated further. China's become more militarily provocative against U.S. air and sea craft flying in international and sailing international waters. And so this was not a win. There was no deliverables. We don't have increased military-to-military communication. So this was not a good trip for Antony Blinken.
What the Biden administration is trying to do is that they're trying to just establish some guardrails and put a level of stability underneath the US-China relationship. The US-Soviet relationship all through the Cold War had deep mechanisms for consultation and crisis management and avoidance of accidental conflict. Now, the Chinese have been absolutely resistant to doing that sort of thing with the Americans. Even now, they refuse to resume direct military-to-military contact, which makes all their ultra-aggressive manoeuvring in the waters around Taiwan and Japan and the South China Sea very, very dangerous. It would be a pity if the Biden administration is changing its policy on China, but I don't think that's what it's doing. I think it's just going to keep up the strategic competition, but try to have a level of dialogue and management of the day-to-day relationship. That can be a little confusing for a Democratic electorate to work out what's going on, but Blinken is a very sober, very capable Secretary of State, and I think that this was a sensible visit. You want to see the two greatest powers on earth talking to each other.
Tensions have been high after multiple Chinese spy balloons floated over the US mainland earlier in the year. The presence of these spy balloons have been downplayed by President Joe Biden.
China has some legitimate difficulties unrelated to the United States. And I think one of the things that balloon caused was not so much that it got shot down, but I don't think the leadership knew where it was and knew what was in it and knew what was going on. I think was more embarrassing than it was intentional.
You know, the Chinese are playing a game of Go, which is a 2,500-year-old board game where the objective is to surround more territory than your opponent. And so what you see playing out now is the Chinese doing that. They've been in the Middle East, right, with Iran and Saudi Arabia trying to broker a deal. They're with Russia trying to influence the Ukraine fight. They're now in the Caribbean in a overt way. They've been in Central America trying to do bases. And so what you see is them just trying to surround us all the way around. And similar to the balloons, it's just another way of exercising their power.
President Xi is the strongest, most powerful dictator that China has had in decades. Trust me, there is no way he doesn't know what's going on all the time, everywhere. It is incredibly naive for Biden to think that, and it makes me question his mental capacity that much more if he's going to sit there and think about that. And that's why China thinks we're so weak. They lie to us all the time. You can never trust anything China says. The fact that President Xi said that it was a great meeting tells me that Blinken went in kind of hat in hand giving concessions. That's never what you want to do. I mean, what should have happened was Blinken should have talked to them about the fact that they continue to send fentanyl across the border, the fact that they have a spy center going up in Cuba, the fact that they're building up their military and basically preparing to go to war with America. What we needed to do was show strength. I don't think that happened.
And that is the constant fear an incident could lead to an escalation not seen in recent history around the world.
Over the past 2.5 years, the United States has taken a series of purposeful, strategic steps, both at home and abroad, to strengthen our country and our standing around the world. We've made historic investments in our infrastructure, technology, industrial capacity, competitiveness. We've deepened our engagement and alignment with allies and partners around the world in ways that would have been unimaginable a few years ago. That's the backdrop for the relationship between the United States and the People's Republic of China, one of the most consequential in the world. Both the United States and China have an obligation to manage this relationship responsibly. Doing so serves the best interests of the United States, of China, indeed, of the world.
One thing that's important to keep in mind, just trying to look at this as objectively as possible, is, we recognize that to Beijing, American forces on Taiwan, obviously a lot of arms, eavesdropping facilities, all kinds of technology and stuff that belong to the U.S. and is operated jointly between the U.S. and Taiwan, is seen as much the same thing. So the U.S. gets excited about this kind of thing, but I think to Beijing, this is more of the same of what they tend to do. I think it is. There's no question it's alarming to the U.S. government because they have a lot of facilities, military facilities in southern Florida that they don't necessarily want, the Chinese listening in on, communications intercepted with ship traffic and the like. We've also reported this morning that there are actually now 4 listening facilities on Cuba. They were all there since at least 2019, but we believe that they are developing other facilities like that, and it's a concern to the Biden administration, who's now working to try to counter it.
And we know that over time, the Chinese have been wanting to ramp up. The United States believed for a while, this administration, the previous one, that would be the 2030s before they got aggressive. Recently, military leaders in the United States have said, no, China is trying to bring this to a boil by 2027. So in order to do that, they've got to get all the pieces in place. And so if they start transiting their own aircraft carriers off Florida, at some point they're going to say, hey, I'll tell you what, you stop going through the Taiwan Straits and we'll stop going through there. And so you can see them putting all these game pieces in place towards a confrontation sometime the next couple of years.